Hello and welcome to the Aviation Barbecue, which we're shooting here in the UK during the fourth week of lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic. The good news is today I'm talking about one of my favourite subjects, which is the Eurofighter Typhoon. The Typhoon has been in service for about 15 years now, and it's come a really long way during that time, from initially being an air defender to today being a true multi-role platform. Talking to us today is Owen Thompson. Owen was a previous RAF Typhoon pilot, and now he works for BAE Systems, so he's well versed in that progress that the aircraft has made. Owen, thank you so much for joining us. Firstly, how are you and where are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks, Jamie. Good to speak to you again. Really well. I'm down in Cambridge. I've got a 3-month-old baby in the house, and it's beautiful weather. So just trying to make the most of being at home.
Okay. Well, the weather's great. I mean, isn't it? It's amazing that we've got this weather. I know we're in lockdown, but the weather's made a huge difference, hasn't it?
Yeah, suits the barbecue theme, doesn't it?
It really does. Yeah, there's been a lot of barbecuing going on here, and I need to point out it's not all meat. Last night we made pizza in the pizza oven there, which I'm going to show a little clip of that later on. But I'm glad you're well. So can you just tell me a little bit about your RAF career and when you left the Air Force and what you're doing now, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always start, if I'm going to talk about my RAF career, people always ask, have you always been interested since you were a little kid, and have you always wanted to be in the Air Force? And I think for me, I probably wasn't. I started to get interested as a teenager, just generically, as I think most people do. But it actually started when I couldn't choose a career. And my dad got annoyed and took me down the pub when I was about 15 or 16 for a pint of Coke, of course. And
absolutely.
sat me down with one of those careers booklets, those A to Zs that they give you in school. And he said, choose one of those that you think looks like fun, bit of a cliche. And I just had a browse through it, and I thought, well, a fighter pilot does look like fun. If I'm being honest, that looks like a good choice. And so he bundled me up in the car there and then, and we drove down to the careers office in Bristol. And I was obviously too young to apply, but they said, get yourself in the Air Cadets and sign up for a sixth form scholarship, which I did. So that was really how I got into it without even realizing much of what I was applying for. I mean, for God's sake, Jamie, I hadn't even watched Top Gun. So it wasn't even...
Goodness me.
I know, which I got heavily bullied for once I'd started. But yeah, that was how I started, really. And I got into it, and I got through the sixth form scholarship and joined. Going through Air Cadets was great fun. Spent a couple of years in the Air Cadets. And when I got my sixth form scholarship, that was a requirement anyway to stay in the Air Cadets. Got some good experiences there, a bit of adventurous training and free flying. And then started up, and the training system was much the same as what you've heard off of Dan Lowe's. Started off on the tutor. Always remember my first flight in the tutor and getting airborne and just thinking to myself, I can't believe I'm being paid to sit here and learn to fly. This is just crazy. So
you immediately saw that even though you hadn't got a particular aviation background, you're loving it straight away.
I was loving it. Yeah, I just found it hard to believe that it was a job, and it's obviously challenging, and it's not all really, really pleasant, but it's great fun. And I just couldn't believe that I was being paid to be sat in an aircraft. And I actually went through elementary flying training out of RAF Whitton, just up the road from where I am now, and just floating around Cambridgeshire, learning to fly. It was just great fun, fantastic times, really good. So I went on from there through the Tucano and onto the Hawk, the same as Dan Lowe's and all the other guys who've gone through in the last decade or so. Got a bit of an eye injury on the Hawk, unrelated, and took a year out from flying, which is where I went to do the Typhoon display manager job for just over a year. Had a great year or so, actually. It's really nice to float around the display circuit, doing the manager role, getting to know the Typhoon, even though I wasn't on the aircraft yet. And obviously at the time, I didn't know if I would ever end up on something like Typhoon. I still had a lot of hurdles to get through and a lot of selection criteria to make before I got onto a platform like that. So I went through the rest of my flying training once I recovered from that injury. I didn't do fantastically well through fast jet training. I did fail quite a few flights and found myself only really getting strong towards the back end of the course once I'd really assimilated all the information. And so I didn't know when it came to our roll disposal which type of aircraft I'd get sent onto, because if they were to look at the whole track record, it wasn't gleaming, but towards the end of the course I had quite a strong end. So I'll never know really if I got sent through to the Typhoon as a bit of an experiment onto the single seat jet, but it was a great experience. And the conversion unit went absolutely fine. So it was really good, and I enjoyed that, moving over to Lincolnshire and getting in a Typhoon for the first time. My first trip in a Typhoon, and I think most people's first trips were, if not still are, scheduled to have a performance takeoff at the start. So the first time you actually get to fly the jet, you do a max reheat, take off into the almost vertical, and it's a really great experience. It's like a nice milestone to have achieved getting onto the platform, which is very cool.
That's on your first flight, but you're in a T-bird, presumably.
Yeah, I was actually, but my second flight was my first solo. But loads of guys going through have their first flight as their first solo. So that's not unheard of at all. And of course, it's going to go that way completely when they get rid of more of the T-birds. It's not already starting to go that way. So loads of guys, there were guys on my course whose first solo was their first flight in the aircraft, which is very cool.
And I guess that shows how great the simulator is now, and how, to prepare for that. So you go live flight as your first solo. That's pretty incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It really is. And I think it's a fantastic achievement for technology, but I always think if I owned a fighter jet, and it was my own money that I was putting on the line to send out someone brand new in the Typhoon, I'd want to fly them dual at least once. But the reality is, actually, it's absolutely fine, and the guys do very well flying solo first time. And of course, people have been doing that since the start of the history of aviation. So all through World War II, and the guys on Spitfires and things.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, how did your RAF career go after the OCU then? You obviously went to the front line.
Moved on to 11 Squadron, which I absolutely loved, and you really start to get a sense of purpose when you join a squadron. I remember as I was getting towards the back end of the OCU, you don't know which squadron you're going to be put onto. You might have expressed a preference, but it's really down to the selection boards and the squadron commanders. And I bumped into one of the 11 Squadron pilots in the simulator building who accidentally let slip and sort of hinted at me that I was being brought over to 11 Squadron, which was my preference at the time. And I just felt on top of the world. I was so chuffed that I'd got the squadron I wanted. I had loads of mates on that squadron, and it really starts to give you a sense of purpose that you're now getting towards being operational and part of an almost family unit on the squadron. Really enjoyed that. Had a great first tour on 11 Squadron. Ended up going and getting electronic warfare instructor qualification, which helped me a lot. Got my pairs lead status, and then moved up to Lossiemouth up the top of Scotland, where I joined 2 Squadron, who were just forming at the time as a Typhoon squadron, having been a Tornado unit before that.
Yeah,
that was quite fun. We were in the old 617 Squadron hardened aircraft shelters, which are really, really atmospheric, really old buildings, but slightly too old. So we then moved into a new squadron building, had a fantastic tour on 11 Squadron. Between those 2 tours, or kind of 2.5 tours, got to go on deployments all over the world, exercises, magic carpet a couple of times in Oman. Red flag, green flag, out to Japan and South Korea with 2 Squadron, which was a real experience. And I think the first RAF squadron to have really deployed out there for quite a while for a prolonged period. So that was really good fun. Got to fly in a Japanese F2 while I was there.
Ooh, nice.
So yeah, it was really cool. I had a really fantastic time. And then reaching the end of that period on 2 Squadron, I'd kind of reached a nice optional exit point and transitioned through into a job in BAE Systems, where I am now, where I head up a team of aircrew advisors, and we're sort of a team of in-house consultants from the end user perspective, and we move around the company helping on things like the Finland bid that's going on at the moment, or guiding new technology that's being brought into both the Typhoon and future platforms like Tempest, things like that.
Oh, that's interesting in terms of your job now, because obviously the jet, I've followed it for a long time. I'm a big fan of the aeroplane. And it's come a long way from those early days on 17 Squadron with Case White when it was doing the initial air defence work. And it's come right through. And I think we saw a real step change kind of about 8 or 9 years ago when it started to move properly into the multi-role. So presumably you saw the jet as it was coming into that phase when it was really starting to embrace that full range of missions.
Yeah, exactly. When I started on 11 Squadron, it was mainly an air-to-air platform, and we were just starting to give some people the multi-role qualification. Actually, when I joined 11, they were just deploying out to red flag. So I was kind of too junior. They were deploying out the day I joined. So I went over onto 3 Squadron, who happened to also be going on exercise at the time to Oman. I managed to get loads of the air-to-surface qualifications before I got the air-to-air qualifications, which was a really odd way to do it. So then when I came back onto 11 Squadron, I got to do loads of close air support because loads of the guys didn't have the qualification for that at the time, and there was loads of close air support exercises that we needed to support.
Yeah.
But now, if you go to a frontline squadron, everybody will be multi-role, always at kind of varying levels of readiness for particular operations, but everybody's multi-role and everybody's qualified in air-to-air and air-to-surface as part of the standard syllabus. So it has come a long way. And I mean, even back then on 11, we were only really carrying paveway 2s at the time. And to think how far the software on the platform has come, and the plethora of weapons that have been introduced through Project Centurion as we transitioned into replacing a lot of those tornado capabilities, has really seen the jet come a long way.
Yeah, it really has. I mean, back then, I think with 11, that was Tranche 1 jets with the kind of the austere air to ground, wasn't it, that initial phase? And then you went over to Tranche 2 and got Paveway 4. And then obviously, as you say, Centurion, you got Meteor, Paveway 4 and Storm Shadow.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's a really good progression. And I think the jet is a sort of ever-evolving beast. It's constantly having upgrades, software upgrades, new weapons introduced. And there's quite a plan for that into the future, moving forward into new radars and things like that. The jet is definitely not stopped evolving, and it's pretty future-proof when it comes to doing the software upgrades and things over the next couple of decades.
It seems to be those upgrades have probably accelerated it, as much as anything else. Over recent years, it's really accelerated. And I guess as an aircrew advisor, one of the things that doesn't get talked about very often is the human-machine interface, because that's kind of an unsung part of that evolution. I get the impression it's become a lot more intuitive and a lot more straightforward. So, it's less about the flying, it's now about managing the systems, and that's become easier as well.
Yeah, it has. And so a lot of people at the air shows, for instance, will always ask, is it a difficult aircraft to fly? And it's theoretically not a difficult aircraft to physically fly. It's designed to be straightforward. It's carefree handling. You can't sort of overstress anything because the computers will G-limit you and things like that. You can't really stall the engines. You can throw the throttles around and the computers will sequence the run-up of the engines and things like that. So it's carefree handling in that sense, although the amount of sensors on the platform and the amount of data that you can now gather up through those sensors means that you become more of a systems operator on board and less of a hands-on pilot in the old traditional sense, as you might have. Yeah. You might think of pilots as back in World War II, and I think that reads across to most modern platforms. They're designed to be easy to fly. They should be easy to physically fly, but you definitely do have a lot of data to assimilate and a lot of decision-making tasks when you're airborne in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, well, I've had a bit of stick time with the Typhoon. I've been very lucky. I've had quite a few flights, and in comparison to other aircraft I've flown, I must admit, when you do things like the auto throttles and things, it does seem to me you can literally point it where you want it to go, and it will just go there.
Yeah, it's self-trimming, which is something we take for granted a lot in the Typhoon, especially people like myself that came straight through onto the Typhoon and didn't spend any time flying the Harriers or the Tornadoes or anything like that. So we do take that for granted. But that's not one of the standout capabilities. It's as you alluded to with the helmet-mounted sight is phenomenal. You've got this display up in the visor that allows you to see your formation members from tens of miles away using the information distribution system to be able to, for instance, if you're on an air-to-surface operation and you're orbiting over a built-up area and you see an explosion and you want to report that back, you can look down at the explosion, you can tag that, slew the sensors in, you could slew the targeting pod in and have a look to see if you can see what that is. You can generate coordinates off of that location using that location that you slewed in visually with your eyes by sensing by turning the helmet in and then putting the reticule over the area where the explosion was. So there's loads of little cool things you can do like that. And the helmet really is a game changer in close range air combat, as well as being able to allow you to have much more situational awareness beyond visual range, and then all the way through into that air-to-surface targeting environment that I've just described there.
You mentioned red flag earlier, and I've been out to a few red flags and observed from afar as much as a civilian can. One of the things that got me about red flag, I'd love to hear about your experience there, but one of the things that really got my interest was the ability to update the mission data. So I remember that actually every day, some of the technicians, the maintainers, are able to come in and look at what the aircraft has seen and hoovered up and kind of update that mission data, which seems incredible to be able to do it that quickly. What did you see on Red Flag?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the strengths of the platform, and that mission data and that customizable mission data set is something that we're always promoting about the aircraft, and it's a very impressive feature. I mean, experiences of Red Flag, where do you start? The whole thing is just a fighter pilot's dream. It's so much fun. It's a phenomenal experience. I haven't been on Red Flag since 2016,
Okay.
and I do remember we went out a few weeks early to do some flying with the F-35s and some of the other American platforms that were out there, a small team of us. So I was lucky to have a few weeks to bed into my hotel room in Vegas before Red Flag kicked off. But what I do remember is over those few weeks, obviously, like wandering around Nellis is a phenomenal place anyway, as an airbase, and as a sort of, as an aircraft spotter, to be able to look at all the different platforms that they've got there is phenomenal. But then almost overnight, the airfield turns into a Tesco car park full of fighter jets. And I just remember coming into work one day when we'd already been coming into Nellis every day for a few weeks and just thinking, what has happened here? Like, it felt as though the whole US Air Force had landed at this one base, and all the RAF aircraft had come over as well. And suddenly they're just tail fins as far as the eye can see all over the pan. And you can walk down the flight line, and it's quite a long walk of just row after row after row after row of fighter jets. It's so impressive.
Yeah. And
as an exercise, it's a real challenge, and it's a real experience. And I think if you get to go on even one Red Flag, most people in the Typhoon squadrons will say that's one of the big highlights of their career, because it's just phenomenal. It's a really great experience.
I guess it's almost as high-end a mission as you can ever hope to see, I would have thought, on a Red Flag, particularly during the latter stages.
Yeah, it's really high-end, and it's hard as well. We do quite a long workup before we go out to make sure that we've practiced that sort of degree of complexity before we go. And obviously, again, the simulator comes into that. That's a great environment for practicing a high-end contested, degraded environment where there are a lot of hostile platforms that you might not have the assets to put up in the actual airspace on a normal day's training. So the simulator can be great for that. And then the exercise itself is always very complex, very high-end, loads of learning points that come out. And usually for Typhoon, it's really satisfying to see the ability of the jet to be really interoperable with all the different F-jets and all the American types, particularly the high-end ones, the newer F-22 and F-35 type integrations, and the way the formations work and operate together is really satisfying. I think one of the standout things for me as well on Red Flag was the survivability of the Typhoon. It's also really satisfying to come back from those missions and be able to debrief, and you never, because you're obviously not firing real weapons out there, you never truly know quite 100% how the mission's gone until you pour through the debrief in detail with everybody in the same room. And it's always exciting to see whether you've performed correctly and you've survived the mission or whatever. And generally Typhoon does very well in terms of survivability, and that's attributable to those complex sensors that we've got, allowing us to see and avoid and survive those types of hostile engagements, both from the air platforms and from the surface platforms.
Are you the missions you flew, were they predominantly air to air or air to ground? Were you doing a bit of a mixture, kind of a swing role, multi-role type scenario? Yeah,
we were doing some mixture when I was out there. I was only just a pairs lead when I went, so I felt like I got thrown in the deep end of just you just kind of get given your wingman and thrown into the mass brief, and off you go, and there's a whole day of planning, and then there's a whole day of execution, and but then you're really pleased when you come out the other end and it's not gone too horrifically badly, and it gives, it can give you a real that's a good way of putting it, isn't it? But I mean, it's just an incredible experience. And so we were flying mainly air to air. I think my first mission we took out live Paveway 2s. There are live bombing ranges out there as well. So it's a very high end exercise, and it's difficult and it's challenging, but it is extremely worthwhile. It really is a highlight.
What's it like when I just think about the bits that I see. So when you're walking out to the jet and you're getting in the jet and you're taxiing out, then you're sitting on the end of runway surrounded by Raptors, F-35s, F-16s, F-15s. Well, what's going through your mind? Or are you just that focused on what you've got to do? Do you actually get a moment to go, wow, there's a lot of stuff here?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do need to stay focused as you're crewing into the jet, and particularly if you've got a formation and you're trying to coordinate with people and the timelines are tight. So you're checking in, you've got a taxi slot, you can't be running late and getting distracted. But at the same time, you do want to soak up the atmosphere. And if you're not on the very, very first wave that goes out, then by the time you get to your aircraft, there are other jets on the runway taking off. There's a real atmosphere that there's something going on, and there's such a massive activity going on around you. It's really exciting, particularly on the night waves. It's just, you can just see the burners after burners after burners on the runway, the parallel runways there. And it's I suppose you can definitely soak up the atmosphere while still remaining focused on your own mission set that you've been tasked with.
It's really interesting to hear how the fact that Typhoon has fitted in so well into that kind of that F-Jet kind of led situation. How has that gone across for you, translated into flying in operations, for example? Is that a similar kind of, because you'll need to go out to an operational area and fit in the same kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, that sort of really high-end, near-peer mass warfare scenario is obviously not taking place for real. But the types of operations we have been on have tended to be, we do a lot of quick reaction alerts, which is surprisingly similar to what Ian was speaking about on the last aviation barbecue, you know, and he was talking about how it's a whole force operation and you've got the tankers and everything every time you get airborne.
Yeah,
it's very similar still, and we do a lot of QRA. We do QRA in the UK, we do it in the Baltics. I've operated QRA out of Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, obviously the Falklands, and North and South in the UK. Most of the operations are air-to-air. There are still some air-to-surface operations going on in the Middle East, but they're not hugely contested like you would experience on Red Flag.
Cool.
That said, there is a lot of integration that needs to go on, and there's a lot of information sharing that takes place, particularly on those Middle East operations. And the jet is very good at that. Right. And it's getting better every day with the experience that the platform gains, and also with the software upgrades and the incremental weapons upgrades that the platform gets as well. So it's already good, and it's getting better.
Any particular missions that stand out for you? I mean, there must be a couple of particularly impressive things that you've been and done in the Typhoon.
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, I won't talk to any of the Middle East operations because most of those are still ongoing. On the QRA side, I've had some very memorable missions intercepting Russian fighters out in the Baltics, Russian transport aircraft. And anytime you get an actual real-life scramble is a really exciting experience, and the alarm goes and you're running out to the hangar and jumping in the jet, getting airborne. And, you know, it's something, it's not a training mission. I did have one particularly memorable sortie back in the UK where I was on QRA and I scrambled on what was a training scramble. And I was over Wales doing a practice intercept onto a business jet, which got turned into a real intercept halfway through the mission.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was quite cool. And I intercepted an airliner over the Central Airways up the spine of the UK and took that down into Manchester. It transpired there was a bomb scare on board. But that was always there was a bomb hoax on board. And for some reason, the pilot had also stopped communicating with air traffic. So the whole thing was quite interesting. That one always stuck out for me. And also I remember, I don't think I realised when I was airborne at the time the significance of what was going on, because as we were cruising along the top of Manchester and I'd been tasked with taking some photographs and getting some identification on the tail number of the aircraft and things like that, so getting to within a visual range that I could see the aircraft, there were people on board who were already live streaming it on the internet. So they were pointing the cameras out the window and live streaming. In my current role, I work on a lot of development of the platform, and we're looking at future systems and how we might integrate those into the aircraft as time goes on. So I suppose the biggest one that we've got coming up on the horizon is the new electronic, or the E-scan radar system that will be integrated onto the aircraft. That's quite a big step forward for Typhoon, and it should be a huge step up in capability as well. The MEXCAN radar that we've got at the moment is very, very good as MEXCANs go, but some of the capabilities that will be afforded by the new E-scan radar will be just phenomenal, a real step forward in capability.
It helps that it's also got those two EJ200s that are pretty remarkable to give it blistering performance, which it clearly has.
Yeah, and that's another thing I think we take for granted. The aircraft is phenomenally powerful, and it makes it a lot of fun to fly from a pilot's perspective. I won't make comparisons with other aircraft, but it is a lot of fun, and it is ridiculously powerful, as witnessed by the performance takeoffs that we can do, the performance within visual range if you're going to do those kinds of basic fighting maneuver engagements, and just generally by the performance of the aircraft, being able to sit up very, very high and fly very fast at very low fuel consumption is a real useful capability. And then lastly, having those two huge EJ200s on the back are also quite handy for carrying all those new weapons that we can get on board. One of the things that always amuses me on a Typhoon is that you have to practice the single engine drill as you would with any other twin engined aircraft. If you lose an engine, pretty much the drill for us is if we're going to practice it in the circuit, and we'll bring one throttle back to idle to practice only having a single engine, you just bump the other throttle up by a couple of percent, and the circuit's largely the same. It doesn't really make a huge difference, and it's very cool to have that redundancy on board with the engines.
What a great jet. Owen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about the Typhoon. Really appreciate it, and look after yourself, and speak to you again soon.
Okay, thanks Jamie, it's all right.
Great Typhoon chat with Owen. I really enjoyed talking to him about, it still does, it just blows my mind when I'm talking to these guys who are so much younger than I am, and they've already finished their RAF.
That's not difficult.
So now he's obviously involved in taking that experience that he got on the front line when he was with the RAF, those things he's been and seen and lived with, and actually now feeding that back in through working through the manufacturer. That's coming back.
So I didn't know they did that. I didn't know that BAE Systems actually employed a cadre of pilots that have been there and done that, and putting all that knowledge back into as an end user perspective to kind of, I guess, refine the product from a user's point of view. So when they're selling the jet, they know that what they're saying, that it fits the requirement. It does fit the requirement, because the people that use it are refining that jet all the time. I thought that's a fantastic thing to hear about.
Yeah, I think that also enables the kind of the more test pilot community who may have been more in the test world. It gives them that linkage back to the current kind of front line. So, and the front line feeds in as well, of course, because the likes of the Typhoon test community at BAE Systems at Wharton, they've got a completely symbiotic relationship with 41 Squadron, for example, which is the operational evaluation squadron. So they work really closely all the time, whereas the aircrew advisors are guys who've got that experience, and now they're coming over to work for the company, and they're actually they're looking at all those new bits of technology that's coming along to make sure it fits in with the mold of how you want it to work in the cockpit.
What I thought was particularly nice to hear about was that how he started. You know, that he didn't know what he wanted to do as a kid, and his dad took him down the pub and, you know, got him that Diet Coke and said, "What looks exciting?" And to me, that was really real stamp of approval for the RAF. Really, I mean, they say that it's no ordinary job, right? But I mean, it really isn't. There really isn't any other career path that you can go from not knowing what you want to do to having such an amazing amount of achievement in your life. And now look at him now. It was, yeah, it was really lovely to hear, actually.
I think it's amazing also to see that, you know, you come in through the air cadet route, you know, you get involved, so you get a bit of a grounding of what the RAF's about, so you can get a feel of what it's like through to, as you said, you know, the scholarship side of things, into his first flight, and he's sitting in his tutor going, unbelievable,
Totally.
which is, you know, it just shows
that Zoom climb.
yeah, and it shows that it is open to, you know, you don't have to come to it from a specific walk of life, for example, in order to get into this career. And, you know, it is open to people, even if you don't have an aviation grounding, you know, even if you don't know the sharp end of a Typhoon from the other, you know, it's
absolutely. And I also noticed as well with a lot of pilots that they're not necessarily even get through the first time. You know, there's a second and a third and a fourth chance, and it may not always be your first choice of path that you get, but there is always something, and it's remarkable, really.
And then you take it all the way through, and he's talking about flying on a red flag. So I remember the first time we went there.
Absolutely, early 90s, wasn't it? Yeah, early 90s for one of the first green flags as well.
96.
Okay, mid 90s.
I remember I was driving, and we turned up, and I drove. We went out to the airfield because you'd never been there before. I hadn't been before. I went, look, and your line was,
"Are they all tails?"
Exactly. Looking across the airfield at Nellis, going, are they all tails? Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
Absolutely incredible. One of the things that really struck me was how easy the jet obviously is to fly. I mean, there's 10-ton systems and situational awareness and decision-making things you need to do, but the actual flying the jet, it's really taken care of for you, isn't it? But, you know, that makes it much more of a systems operation now, rather than, as you said, the traditional fighter jet with it in your hands and feeling all the flight maneuvers. But the technology involved in that, I mean, the visor displays that he's talking about, where you look down at an explosion and it's already queuing and tagging it and letting the other battle players know what's going on and where, and that was fascinating stuff. You mentioned about the mission data things you saw at Red Flag and how important that was in flexing the mission and changing the dynamic display of it all. And, you know, Owen himself had been involved in all of those three environments. You know, the hardest missions at Red Flag, the QRAs everywhere, all over the world. I mean, how many locations have QRAs been taking place for Typhoons now? That was quite extraordinary.
Just to talk about the mission data side of it. So, I first went to Red Flag as a journalist with Typhoons in about 2013, and I think it was the deployment he was talking about with 11 Squadron. Okay. And I remember seeing that when the jets were coming back from the missions, the maintainers were hooking up to the jets and downloading the data, all the things that the jet had seen kind of in the electronic spectrum. They were looking at that from the Nellis ranges. They took that away, and then they overnight rewrote bits of the mission data so that the next day the jet was ready for that, and it knew what that was, and it kind of, you know, there's mission data it's a real art that we don't, you know, it's a very secretive art that there's not a huge amount in the outside world known about, and rightly so. But it'll be things like, if it's seen a particular threat in the head-up display, the Typhoon will give you an optimized kind of thing to do if you see that particular threat. I mean, it's down to that level of kind of detail. You also talk about the ease of flying the aeroplane. I'm not a pilot. I'm very lucky to have had quite a few Typhoon trips, and when he was telling me that, when he was saying that, and bear in mind, he frontline fighters wise, I mean, he flew the F2, he had to go in the F2 in Japan, but he's only really known Typhoon. And I remember the first time I flew in a Phantom with the Luftwaffe, coming back from our photos, my pilot said, "Do you want to fly it for a bit?" And I
remember this.
Amazing. And I remember we were on Bremen radar, they were talking to us, and all I had to do really, because I'm in the back, and it is a bit of a coal hole in the back of the F4, but I had to basically look after the speed, the height. That was about it, I think, really. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I mean, literally, my height was all over the place. It was just like, it was too much for me. It was so hard. It was, and then I've had some stick time in Typhoon, and I flew a lot of a particular approach with One Air Force. I flew the whole thing, had it on speed, on the height, on the heading. I got it all done, all the way back down to pretty close. And I'm not a trained pilot, and it was so easy because you have the auto.
Did you feel the jet? I mean, obviously with an F4 and the inputs and everything else, and the Typhoon, it must have felt completely different to you with your control inputs.
The Typhoon, you look through the HUD and you literally have the little aeroplane and you put it on where you want it to go, and it will sit there and it will auto trim, and you can also auto throttle. So you change on the throttle. There's a setting. You set the speed, and that's the speed it will do in the HUD. So to
almost cheating.
Why that's kind of important. I remember being out in Cyprus talking to the Opshada guys with the Middle East operations, and when they brought Centurion in with the Brimstone. So Brimstone's quite a sort of a manually operated weapon. So you need to laze the target, and then you need to fire it, and you need to guide the weapon all the way to the target. You know, and there's nothing secret about that. That's quite well known.
Well, it works. Yep.
So I'm thinking, well, you're in the close air support wagon wheel circling the target. So I was thinking, well, no, you've got to fly the jet, you've got to be following the weapon in, you've got to worry about your wingman, other air-to-air threats. And the guy I was talking to said, well, not really, no, because you put it in autopilot. So you literally set it up in the turn, in the wagon wheel, put it into autopilot, and then you worry about the pod. The jet's doing its thing. Obviously, you've got to keep out your scan and your lookout and your air-to-air threats. But the jet's essentially flying itself around the wagon wheel as you're prosecuting the target. So, and that's the thing I remember thinking back to that F4 of how tricky that was, and manually trying to fly the thing. And bear in mind, I'm a complete novice, and your 3,000 hour F4 dude's going to be all over that. But the Typhoon actually has so much technology built into it that makes the pilot be able to be more of a systems operator. So
you mentioned Centurion earlier. So tell us a little bit about what Centurion actually is. I mean, it's the upgrade that allowed the Meteor, the Brimstone, and the Storm Shadow to be carried, right?
Now, I'm glad you pointed out, because I got that wrong in the film. I said something about Paveway 4. So Paveway 4 came in under what was known as P1EB. This is for the RAF.
That's right, yeah.
So P1EB was like the first real air-to-ground software for the Tranche 2 Typhoons, which are kind of the main operational jets now.
Yeah.
So they had the first air-to-ground weapons. Centurion was an RAF-only program, which is P2E and P3E, and it added Meteor and Storm Shadow. So Meteor is like an AMRAAM successor, which is a long-range, beyond visual range air-to-air missile. It then added Storm Shadow, which is a standoff cruise missile. And then P3 added the Brimstone, which is a small laser-to-target weapon. And
all of that Centurion, right?
That was Centurion. There were some other things as well. There was some human-machine interface upgrades in the cockpit. But essentially, Centurion was designed to enable the RAF to retire the Tornado GR4. It was bespoke capabilities that the Tornado had that needed to be ported across or brought onto Typhoon before the RAF could retire Tornado, except for the Raptor reconnaissance pod. That was the only thing that didn't go.
That's a bit of a missing.
The recce pod. Yeah. But other than that, everything was good.
So one of the other really important parts of the Typhoon is obviously the radar, isn't it? I mean, you've got all of this information. It's got to be sapped into the jet somehow. So one of the most important areas of that is obviously the radar. So tell me a little bit about what you know about the Typhoon's radar capabilities.
I did warn everyone at the start of this film that Typhoon is one of my favourite subjects. So radar.
I might go and get a pizza while you're waiting.
Go and get a pizza. So radar-wise, at the moment, the Typhoon has the mechanically scanned radar, which is like it's got a dish in it. It's hardware. Whereas the E-scan still has some hardware, but it's more about the software. It doesn't have moving parts. That's one of the biggest parts.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So so it's an electronically scanned array that has the ability to be more versatile, essentially, and to do more things with different modes, and it can do modes simultaneously. It's the new, it's the new era of radar. It's what a lot of fighters have got, and Typhoon is a bit overdue getting its E-scan radar. It's coming. It's coming in a range of different flavors, if you like, for the different operator nations. But it's really good that Owen was talking about it, because it's a tangible thing that's coming now, and it's kind of top of a lot of people's shopping list of what Typhoon needs to have and will have next.
So Owen was obviously on the front line and experiencing the changes in the maturity of the Typhoon from that pure air-to-air fighter that it started out as, then bringing in the air-to-ground weapons as well. So do you feel that the RAF has somewhat accelerated that in comparison to the other nations that are operating? I mean, from an outsider looking in, it seems we're highly, highly capable at what we do with the Typhoons, whereas some of the others haven't embraced that whole multi-role capability of the jet. What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's true to say that the RAF was at the front edge of multi-role when it came to Typhoon.
Yeah.
There is another nation I can think of that was also very proactive on multi-role.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the others are catching up now. So Italy and Germany and Spain have all kind of got P1EB with the first GPS-guided, laser-guided air-to-ground weapons, and they're now going to move into the next phase. But interestingly enough, the jets that the Luftwaffe is looking at, they're talking about an LTE jet, long-term evolution jet. And in fact, in the latest issue, the May issue of Air Forces Monthly, there's a feature all about LTE, and it explains exactly what that's all about. So actually, the Luftwaffe and the German Air Force is looking at out on that next phase. They're starting to look further down the line. But because it's a partner nation thing, everyone can benefit from it. So all these different things, all these areas where particular air forces have taken the lead on certain things, everyone can benefit. So it all feeds back into the main central core program. So that is a benefit. There's no two ways about it. It's a major benefit.
No, 100%. Yeah, I see that.
Fighter integration. It's integrating the likes of F-15s, Typhoons, those kind of things with your F-22s and F-35s. And they have a different role to play. And so I don't know if they blur in as much as they can operate in the same piece of airspace, and they can do different things. So, for example,
communicate with each other.
In a high-end fight, a fifth-generation fighter will be in stealthy, skinny mode, so it'll have its weapons internally, which means it can't carry a huge amount. So you could, for example, have your Typhoon with a lot more weapons on it, or your F-15EM, which may have up to 16 air-to-air missiles on it, as your kind of weapons truck that's operating at a safer range with your weapons being queued in. So it's about integrating those assets to give you a kind of scalable force. I don't think you can compare them, and actually we're going to have a program that's going to look at the Finnish Air Force fighter competition, which involves the F-35, the Rafale, the Super Hornet, the Gripen and the Typhoon. And we're going to look at what they all bring to the table for Finland. And actually, they all do some things really well, and there's other things they don't do as well. So it's very difficult to compare apples with apples.
Yeah, no, well said. I agree with that. So it's pretty clear that Typhoon is right at the top of its game at the moment, but it's also clear they're always developing it. So where does it go next? What are they looking at?
So it's long-term evolution. So I think initially we've got the radar stuff going on, but that sort of sits outside the core program. Long-term evolution is really important, which is going to be basically keeping the aeroplane going and keeping it credible out past 2050. So one of the main things...
2050, wow.
Yeah, so the LTE, and actually there's lots of that in this feature in Air Forces Monthly. One of the big things is the aerodynamic wing kit. So it's been talked about for a long time. It's basically a new, like a new Lex, and there's new strakes on the leading edge of the wing root. And that is going to open up a lot more aerodynamic capability and stability. And one of the reasons that that's important, initially it was talked about as a kind of an aid to close in within visual range dogfighting, but now it's being looked at more as it will open up the weapons carrying ability of the aeroplane more. So it will be able to carry a lot more stores in asymmetrically as well. So a bigger variety of weapons. So that's a really important part of it. And they're looking at a new cockpit as well, maybe with a large area display. And a lot of this is all about also proving technology as you look towards the future combat air system. So either FCAS or the UK Tempest program. So there's some stuff that's looking at kind of the Typhoon will roll some of this stuff out. Advanced cockpits, data links, that kind of thing. They're looking at some of the stuff that the US Air Force and US Navy's been looking at in terms of combat cloud type stuff. So really getting those data links and situational awareness, that kind of stuff. So I think that's where we'll see the jet going in the future.
Interesting.
The thing that gets me about Typhoon is that it's got the core benchmark airframe. Like the engines are just bulletproof. The EJ200s, when the jet when they go on deployment with Typhoons, they don't take spare engines. They don't need to. That's unbelievable.
That's incredible.
When I was in Cyprus talking to a guy about the deployment, they actually took an engine out and replaced it because no one had done it. They just did it because they wanted to show someone how to do it, because they don't do it. So it's got those really powerful EJ200 engines and a really good airframe. So it's got that raw performance, which is a great baseline to be able to add things to it. So I mean, and it's not all it's not all plain sailing. There's obviously niggles and problems along the way.
Yeah, of course there is.
That core airframe is pretty powerful.
It caught up quick though, didn't it? I mean, all those early niggles and everything else. I mean, they seem like a lifetime away now. So one of the other mods that I've heard about.
I wouldn't say it did catch up quick. It took a long time. It took a long time in order to start getting the things that it needed to do. And the way that the Eurofighter construct, the overall construct worked, initially it meant that things took an awfully long time to bring in, like new upgrades. Meteor took forever. So actually but there was a new way of doing things which allowed the different partner nations to go and take those leads in particular areas whilst feeding back into the core program. And that's where the changes came. So it was actually post 2013, probably, Operation Elemi in Libya. Post that, I would say, is when it really started to see the whole thing accelerating to where it should have been. Yeah. Rich, great talking Typhoon. I could sit here all afternoon and talk about it and bore you senseless.
Well, the good thing is you can eat pizza hot or cold, so we can take all afternoon at it. That's fine.
Well, that's the idea with the aviation barbecue. You can just sit around and eat pizza and talk about airplanes. That's the plan.
Marvelous.
Which we will carry on doing. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.